Good morning. Thank you for joining this webinar on implementing a simplification strategy in pharma operations. My name is Jim Morris. I'm your webinar host. A few logistics, please. Phones will be muted during the webinar, and there is a point at the end where we can take some questions and provide some answers. Please use the chat feature to submit questions, or use the email that appears on the final slide. Again, thanks very much for joining, taking time from your day. My name is Jim Morris. As I mentioned, I'm with NSF International. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry 30-plus years. I've had roles primarily in quality, operations, and manufacturing at a number of different companies. I lead the excipient certification program for NSF International and also champion quite a bit of our training and education on the U.S. side of our business. This webinar is around simplification strategies and things that we can do. It's not an easy topic and certainly not something that's very easy to undertake, but so important. I'd like to provide some background and context, offer up some simplification strategies to you, and think about responsibility and how to implement such strategies. I should also mention that an underlying premise for this webinar is the reduction of cognitive load such that people can perform work effortlessly or with less effort and with greater degree of success. This is a view of an aseptic filling operation, very different than the aseptic filling operation that I would have started in some years on entry into the industry. And there's inherent complexity in this design and in the work that the individual that's shown here has to perform, and certainly the work that those supporting this individual must perform. This is a view of a continuous manufacturing operation for the production of a solid dose product. There's immense complexity in this design, and there'll be upwards of more than 1,000 parts that need to be assembled, disassembled for cleaning, and reassembled. And complexity of this nature can only be tackled with simplicity, with simple solutions. To achieve consistency and error-free production, there needs to be excellent training and a real focus on the documentation that's used to support the operation. Another level of complexity is procedural complexity in operations. This is a very simple depiction of a water system and the series of instructions that would support that system. And people need to essentially understand what's underlying these instructions in order to perform work. One system, quite a bit of complexity with a single system. In order to support decisions in operations, our quality management system is designed to really provide us with the information we need. But there's inherent complexity in those systems. And this is a view of the events at a particular manufacturing facility, and you can see from the Pareto that procedural noncompliance stands out. There are approximately 2,100 events here, and over 30% of those are associated with procedural noncompliance. Anyway, the volume of events that a site has to manage, and to manage well, is often very, very immense, very intense. And a typical pharma site struggles to keep up. We need to figure out how to simplify operations. So there's inherent technological and procedural complexity, and then we are who we are. We're wired in a particular way. We don't have infinite capacity. We have finite capacity. So when we think about cognitive load, which is that ability that we have to process information, we only have finite capacity, and people will have different thresholds. And those thresholds will shift according to where they are in the day and the kind of work they're performing and how comfortable they are with their work. And the external environment that we work in greatly influences our ability to process information. It greatly influences our cognitive capacity, as shown here with the cup that only has finite capacity. Our external environment may interrupt us, cause distraction, and those things change our ability to process information. In other words, it reduces our ability to process. We see a reduction in capacity. If we have to take on new tasks that demand more of our intellect or our cognitive load, it's something to bear in mind. And often we're asked to multitask, to carry out multiple tasks at one time. These things all demand our resources. Taking a look at multitasking, you can see from the chart tasks A, B, and C, and they'll be different tasks. The nature of those tasks will be different. Say task A is a new task. It's going to demand more of us than, say, task B and C. Or task A may be a very complex task and therefore demands more of us than the other tasks. You can see over time, there are points in time where our workload levels are going to be higher. And when we're beyond, if you look at the lower diagram, when we're beyond that optimal zone, we're overworked or underworked, there are going to be greater degrees of probability of error. And we have to find our way into that optimal zone. So how do we do that? How do we assure that when we are performing at a maximum level, we undertake strategies so that we're essentially able to perform with less risk of error? And there's this constant tug of war or balancing act between the resources we have inherently in who we are and where we are during the day and the demand on those resources. Well, the strategies that we can employ to maximize performance, what would they be? Well, we could offload work, push it off, in other words, reduce demand. We could design work differently through the use of automation, say, to assure that we can perform work and essentially, again, reduce demand. And ultimately, we can simplify work. And that's the focus here. Is let's think about the fact that we have finite resources. We have pressing demand. Now, if we simplify, we can help folks make work easier to perform consistently and flawlessly, just like these two guys in their hard hats performing good work with very good safety practices, if you notice. So these are the strategies I'd like to put forward. We can develop GMP habits, we can employ triage, and we can look at documentation. And some of you will probably say, well, what about engineering design? What about lean techniques? Well, all those things are also excellent strategies to simplify work. The first two I've listed are unique in many respects, and I'd like to put them forward and challenge ourselves to think about their link to simplification. The third one, I think most people would be quite familiar with, but it's important to cover that topic. So let's start off with GMP habits and its link to simplification. So here are people performing work, and our goal is to provide them with the tools they need to be successful so that they can work consistently with less effort and flawlessly. As we bring them into work, generally they'll undertake a set of orientation, and they'll get to the unit operation for training, and then ultimately there'll be job-specific training for the work that they're going to undertake. And if we think about the nature of training at the unit operation, there's going to be general information that they need to know to undertake work. And everybody in the unit essentially has to be trained in these areas that are listed: good documentation practices, gowning, basic hygiene, incident reporting, and you can make a list of a number of things that everybody essentially must need. And then there are those job-specific skills and SOPs that people need to be trained on, depending on their role, related to equipment preparation or setup, cleanup, all those things that are very specific to the job that they have to carry out. Well, the opportunity in simplification lies on the left. It lies with those basic skills, but very important skills that have to be undertaken on a routine basis. And that's where I'd like to put forward the premise that if we can develop GMP habits, there'll be less risk of error in those areas. And when you look at trends of deviations, so often what you find are some of the basics are being missed. And those basics muddy the system, and they result in time being required to investigate, document, and justify, and hopefully put forward the premise that things are in a state of control. So thinking about GMP habits, when is the best time to install a GMP habit? Well, I think generally speaking, early in somebody's work, in other words, early in their tenure, during onboarding to the company or to the site, or when they've been transferred into a unit operation. The premise for this is the development of the argument that there's a habit loop that we can put forward. The reference here is Charles Dunning's The Power of Habit, where he puts forward the principle of the habit loop. in that there is a prompt or a cue to perform a task. There's a task itself, and then there's a reward, recognition for a task well done. And with repetition, that task becomes embedded over time. Just like you would see a pathway through a valley floor here being embedded, being essentially grained into the floor such that everybody knows which path to travel. The same thing is occurring neurologically speaking. Over time, we're developing a pathway and embedding that habit, if you will. So stepping back to the Pareto chart that I put forward earlier, you can see that there are a number of issues at the site, and the procedural noncompliance issues, the issues related to, say, validation complaints. Well, you could step back from this analysis and probably at most sites pretty quickly determine what are the most common GMP issues that the site is facing. And some might be these that are listed here: equipment logbook issues, batch documentation issues, gowning issues. You'll have your own list. And the argument is that under habits, we can use this example where we could set a goal, and that is, in this example, to minimize logbook entry errors. That's the task that has to be completed as effortlessly and as flawlessly and as error-free as possible. And if we can design the training such that that task is repeated and over and over, there's a cue, there's the task itself, and a reward, we're going to set ourselves up for success. What's key in this concept, essentially, is that there are two things that really matter, that there's standardization. In other words, that the logbooks are essentially the same, that they are the same. That in this case, an equipment maintenance log is going to be true across the site, that there won't be too many variations or hardly any variations of an equipment maintenance log. We want to standardize as much as possible. And then as we train people to establish that habit, we do so through repetition. And that's the most important premise. And that's essentially what Charles Dunning puts forward in the habit loop. It's through repetition that we embed that habit. And embedding that habit, what's happening is we're freeing up resources, cognitive resources, to focus on other tasks. It's not that we do this particular task of entering data into a logbook in an automatic fashion, but we do so much more effortlessly. So the argument here on the GMP habits is to take a look at the GMP issues that are occurring frequently at the site, stand back from those, and think about the training that can be repeated over and over to establish GMP habits. Build that into Tier 1 training for all personnel that's operating in the GMP space. In doing so, they're freeing up resources to be able to focus on other tasks. So that's an aspect of simplification. Think about GMP habits, strategy 1. I'd like to switch gears now and consider this strategy that I've titled Employing Triage. Going back to the Pareto chart, we can see a host of different issues, host of different events. What's important to bear in mind is that not all events are the same, and these need to be treated differently. Those that are more significant should be treated with greater intensity than those that are less significant. And most sites look to do that. However, many sites don't do it very well. It's not that one size fits all, and that's a basic premise. What we need to do is assure that we've established risk thresholds. In other words, that we're distinguishing between the low-level risks, those that are, say, of higher risk, medium risk, and certainly the more critical issues. But we're treating them differently, and that we're handling those in a manner such that our effort is a function of the risk that's involved. Well, when we think about triage, it's important to, first off, establish clear criteria. Be sure that we distinguish between minor, major, and critical, and provide examples of each of events that fit those criteria. If we have really good examples, people have a good reference point. And then assure that there's training and monitoring. Don't assume that people will just get it. Train and monitor and follow up. Train and monitor. It's really important that people get experience and have a good reference point for establishing a triage technique, say around deviations. The outcome, if triage is not employed well, is that generally what we would see is that we have poor investigations, large number of open investigations, open CAPAs, lots of reoccurrence, and ultimately bottlenecks, backlogs, and these things result in high levels of stress. In focusing on this, and frankly what happens at many sites, because this is so common at many sites that we work with at NSF, is that you could almost say that people are chasing their tail. And I'm sure some of you on this call can appreciate that. If we can move away from that and triage appropriately and focus our effort on those things that truly matter and move things through that are of less risk much more readily, we end up with a balanced system. And the benefit is ultimately that we have more time to put forward in root cause analysis where it really matters. We end up with much more robust CAPAs, fewer open issues, less reoccurrence, and ultimately less systemic risk. So in looking at this technique of triage, which applies to deviations and other elements of the quality management system, such as change control, we focus our effort appropriately. In a sense, we're simplifying operations. If we don't do this, we end up with systemic risk. So it's imperative that we really think about triage as something that's important and a determinant of the health of a site. Now I'd like to go to the more traditional aspect of simplification, which is documentation simplification. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that now. The question is, how much information do we need to carry out work? Do we need all the meat on the bones, as this Picasso shows, or can we do with something simpler, with a little bit less meat but sufficient information? Basic question. So what changes can we encourage? The current state, as many of you can probably appreciate, is that we have many documents, many SOPs that exceed 50 pages, 75 pages, or what have you. Very complicated SOPs for personnel to follow. And we need to think about shifting to something that's simpler. And this is a very difficult process. But we want to get down to SOPs that are really user-friendly, which means that maybe that 50-page SOP becomes a 10-page SOP, or it stays at 50 but becomes quite a bit clearer. Now, generally, what we would see is a reduction in the SOP when it's been revised to something that's fewer pages in number, and there are a number of work instructions that support it, or job aids, or something such as smart labels. As an example, there was, as an example of a smart label, a page of an SOP, a section of an SOP had text taken from it and moved into the labeling that was used to pull samples. This has to do with water sampling. And some of the text in the SOP talked about frequency, the type of container that should be used, the volume that should be taken, what to do if there was something abnormal during the sampling exercise. The information that was embedded in that SOP was essentially built into the label, thus reducing the amount of information that people needed to extract from the SOP or understand in order to carry out their work, in this case sampling. And ideally these labels would be printed from LIMS and the information is present. That's one way to simplify. So what changes can we encourage in document simplification? The current state at many sites is a large number of SOPs, such as, using this example, say a site will have 800 SOPs. Some of your sites may have quite a bit more, and some number of work instructions. Well, what is the desired state? What's optimal? It's easy to say from this vantage point, but ideally we'd have fewer SOPs and a larger number of work instructions. The example here is we flip those two numbers, and we've got 200 SOPs and say 800 work instructions. What we're doing is we're putting the information where work is being carried out. And if it's done well through smart design, ultimately we're reducing cognitive load. The situation on the left is one where there's going to be high levels of noncompliance with SOPs, as we've noted in that proto chart seen earlier. The situation on the right, the desired state, is going to be ultimately higher levels of procedural compliance. This is an example of a work instruction, say a SMART, quote-unquote, form. And you can look at this document and see features of it that are beneficial to the user, such as on the right-hand side, you've got a single column for signature, helps people see where they're at. Change of shift, you can see where the last individual left off. You could point out features such as the photos and some other features in here that are beneficial to the user. This is an example of taking a form, maybe this was very text-heavy originally, and moving it into a format that ultimately reduces cognitive load. It reduces the amount of information people need to process to carry out a task and to do so consistently and flawlessly. So how do we move to that desired state? It's not easy. This is a very difficult thing for sites to undertake. Put forward the straightforward steps that should be thought about. First, you need to understand the SOP, quite clear. Review with subject matter experts to assure that understanding is on the mark. Step 3, ask the subject matter experts, those that are at the sharp end, those that are most familiar with the task, to highlight those tasks that are critical, say incorrect, or unnecessary. And it's through that effort that you can draft a revision, or the subject matter expert themselves can draft a revision. Go back, review, gain buy-in with the changes. Very important to gain that buy-in. And then test alongside the current state and determine where you're at. That fine-tuning at the end will help you finalize that SOP and move it through your system. Fairly straightforward steps, but not an easy process to undertake. At NSF, we offer some workshops, a series of workshops on SOP simplification, and we have employed an 8-step methodology. And we put forward some principles around risk assessment to assure people understand how to identify direct impact steps and to tease out what really matters in an SOP, provide good coaching notes to assure that the implementation of the changes is going to be taken on board really effectively. This 8-step process is effective, it works well, but very difficult to undertake. So I'd like to speak to that in just a moment. So I've spoken briefly around these 3 strategies. And you may ask, who takes ownership for this? Where does the responsibility lie for implementation? Well, it's not easy, as I've mentioned. Anything that is going to present some opportunity to the site is going to come with some effort. So I'd like to offer up some strategies for executing on documentation simplification. Subject matter experts, or the SOP owners, will be charged and will take on board the development of user-friendly SOPs. They need to be trained and understand what good looks like, going back to the form that I showed just a minute ago. Line supervisors need to be thinking about simplification. They need to challenge this to be champions of simplification and to encourage their personnel to take on board the technique. And the L&D, learning and development function, also needs to be involved to assure that there's a good transition to the simpler approach that's built into a revised SOP, and that there are appropriate measures to measure competency. But this is really an effort that is cross-functional. And the system owners, say for the documentation system or other systems, say the change control system, also need to take ownership for this. They need to be involved in any effort, whether it's about documentation simplification or installing GMP Habits, what have you. It's so important that system ownership, that the quality system owners be involved as well. And management support is vital. It's so important that you have that. What we've learned at sites that are taking on board initiatives such as those that I've described here, and initiatives around SOP simplification, management's commitment is generally there. It's usually pretty typical for management to get on board with the concept of simplification. Where management struggles is in the devotion of the resources to ensure the simplification technique is taken on board, devoting the time, the resources to see these things through. We need to do more than just walk the talk. But there's some other things that we've learned that are really important, and I've listed them here. Other measures of success for any one of these strategies around simplification. If you take on board an initiative such as SOP simplification, it's so important to have a champion at the site, somebody that understands what good looks like, somebody that can mentor and help people along, somebody that can track results. It's also important to embed the objectives in people's individual objectives. X number of SOPs revised over the course of a period of time, the installation of appropriate habits, the monitoring of those things need to be built into people's objectives. Otherwise, these are not concrete things. Example revisions is very, very important. We need to know what good looks like. Once a site has taken on board an SOP revision process, if they have some really good examples of what's working, that will help others understand where they need to go, and it helps build momentum. And ultimately, we want to measure the benefits. We want to know that procedure non-compliance rates are improving. So measuring results should be part of the overall program. So that gives you a view of some of the aspects that are important to bear in mind in implementing documentation simplification initiatives such as SOP simplification or any one of the other two strategies. So I've covered the key topics I wanted to briefly touch on during this webinar. I hope that you found it to be useful and that there's some tips here that you can take away. That's our intent, is to hopefully offer some information that will be of value to you. And you can certainly come back to us if you have a need or you have a project that you're looking to undertake and you're looking for some support or some advice. We're certainly open to that. So you may have some questions. I'd like to take those now and ultimately also provide the contact information and my email in case you wish to reach out. And as I mentioned, I don't believe I mentioned at the beginning, the slides will be sent, the link will be sent to the webinar participants so that you can view this or your colleagues can view this information. Again, thank you for joining. Questions? A question here on a site that's struggling with SOP simplification. What can be done we've struggled with SOP simplification. Can you offer some tips? Key question, the best thing I can say is, in addition to following some of the points that have been raised in this webinar, do think about starting small and select SOPs that are frequently used, are not the most complex SOPs among the SOPs in your SOP listing, but also look at those SOPs that present some risk and tackle those first and get some quick wins. And therefore, you'll be able to build momentum. Once people see what good looks like and you're able to show some results, it'll be hugely beneficial. Another question, going back to the habit loop, question is, can you provide an example where the cue and reward has worked? That's a very good question. The cue is a little bit difficult. The reward I have seen work in a number of places, and I'd like to offer this simple example of a site that was looking to reduce documentation error, a site in Texas, and people would track their blue ribbons. Blue ribbons were given to groups of people that were reducing the level of documentation error. So they're being recognized for their efforts. Blue ribbon is a very simple thing in Texas. Blue ribbons matter. Nice, simple recognition. So that was the reward on the habit loop. The cue is a little bit more difficult, and I think you need to stretch here and think about something that really prompts people consistently, whether it's like a stop sign. something that gets people thinking, okay, this is an area where I need to be very, very cautious in my entries. Granted, all entries matter in pharma operations, but say you have a GDP prompt in logbooks that gets people to focus and pay a little bit more attention. That would be the cue. Cue is a bit more difficult. The reward is something that's very feasible. What's most important about the habit loop is the repetition. So I hope that's helpful to you. One other question, time I think for just one additional question. This is specifically when you mention there are low levels of work increase error rates. What do you mean by that? That goes back to the image that was shown earlier with the percent workload, and there were points high above the bar, above 100%, that justify simplification, and there's some points below 80%, and I mentioned the error rates typically go up even when there's less workload. And I think that's mostly due to distraction and say maybe even boredom. When people have more time on their hands, they don't focus as much as they should. And as a result, you see error rates can sometimes rise. And that's why it's so important to think about that optimal zone and how to enter into that optimal zone in terms of percent workload. Okay, I'd like to thank you all for joining. Again, these webinar slides, this webinar will be sent via a link. Wish you all a great rest of your day. Thanks again.